Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Inclusive Leadership digital event hosted by the East Midlands and Eastern Regional Board of the CMI. My name's Jamil, and I'm a regional manager here at CMI, and I'll shortly be handing over to Catherine to begin this evening's event. If you have any questions during the session, you can ask them using the live chat box on the right of your screen, and we shall answer as many as we can. Today's session is being recorded and will be shared with you tomorrow for those who book to attend, and will also be available via the CMI website and also the CMI YouTube channel. So now over to Catherine Mishka of the CMI East Midlands and Eastern Regional Board.
Thanks, Jamil. So welcome, everybody. We're delighted to be joined this evening by Laura K. Tomlinson, who is the award-winning director of Train Motivate Excel Limited, and also Cheryl Miller, who's an award-winning business coach, author and mentor, as we discuss inclusive leadership. Hi, Cheryl. Hi, Laura.
Hi.
Nice of you to join us this evening. So,
thank you for the invite, Catherine.
Welcome. Cool. Well, we'll kick off. We've got quite a few questions to get through. So, first of all, let's have the opening question. So, it's a really exciting and topical one. So, Kamala Harris is going to be the first female VP of the USA and the first Asian American and African American Vice President. So what are your hopes for the future off the back of this momentous event?
Shall I start with that one? So first of all, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce her name, so I'm just going to put that out there. But I think there is a saying that you can't be what you can't see, which I subscribe to kind of in part. I think you can be something if you have the right encouragement. But for a lot of people, particularly in the US, just having somebody in that role really helps to raise the expectations of, kind of like women and particularly, people of colour. So I think for that reason alone, it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree, Cheryl. I think in one way, though, my hope for the future is that we don't have that question coming up. I think I'd like to get us to a point where the contents are more important than the packaging of a person. But I also recognise that representation matters. And it is important to see people that go, I can do that. That's someone that looks like me. So I think another aspect of it that I found interesting is that that's a very American thing, whereas in this country, we've had 2 female prime ministers, one from our region. So I'm hoping that we don't get some of the Americanization into our politics.
Excellent. Cool. Right. So statistics show that only 1 in 16 of senior leaders are from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background. So how can we turn the dial on that?
I think we are turning the dial. I just think we're not seeing it as quickly as maybe we'd like to see it. So I was at an awards event probably 2 years ago now when we were allowed out and allowed to see people. And it was for accountants, a Lifetime Achievement Award. And they were honoured maybe, I think, 15 people. And someone said to me, Laura, does it not bother you that everybody there honouring is a white man, pretty much? And I said, well, no, because it's a lifetime achievement. And we're now looking at what what was happening 40, 50 years ago in the profession. And I think if in 40 years' time, we're still seeing the same people being recognised, we've done something really wrong. And one of my key principles is that the inclusion we do now leads to diversity in the future. So I think maybe we're not seeing the pace of change move as quickly as we'd like. Yeah, Cheryl, what do you think of that?
I think I'm a bit more impatient than you, Laura. I think we've been working at this for a while. I think, unconscious bias training, race equality at work, and all of that legislation has been around for a long time, and the dial has not moved enough. I definitely agree with Laura that the dial is moving in the right direction, but I think it is painfully slow. And some of that is because actually sometimes we're just scared of actually quite difficult and awkward conversations. So there was a great story on LinkedIn. I sort of saw a HR professional share, she was involved in a recruitment process in the US a couple of years ago. So she works for a multinational. They were hiring and had a selection of 3 candidates who were African American, who they all felt was really strong. But there was one person on the panel who was very vocal, who, the term that they used was something like, the way that this particular candidate pronounced the word ask made them sound unintelligent. And everybody knew what they were getting at. And, she didn't call that out. And she kind of felt terrible afterwards, the fact that she hadn't called that out. And we need more people calling out those things when it happens. Now, the reality is in that situation, both the black candidates there wouldn't have known what had happened and why they didn't get the role. And the white candidates that ultimately ended up getting the role, they wouldn't have known that actually there was a black candidate that was stronger that was overlooked because of somebody's prejudices. So there is a lot more work to do, and it needs to pick up the pace. I think otherwise people will continue to be disillusioned, and people who are from like a non-white background will continue to feel that they are not welcome and they're not kind of accepted in those senior positions.
Cheryl, do you think that picking up of the pace though risks alienating people that are in those positions already?
I think, well, yes, because it's kind of like turkeys and Christmas, I guess. The reality is, unless we're just going to create loads and loads more board positions, what do? If there are people in positions who are, sort of like maybe say like mediocre and actually, could potentially make way for other people from a more diverse background, what do you do? So yeah, it's a difficult one, but but change needs to be made,
And that's a real challenge, isn't it? Because you've got people that, you use that word mediocre and they don't necessarily know that there are other people that are just as capable, if not more capable than them. They're not aware of that. And I think that's one of the issues that we have is people going, well, I'm doing my job. I've been doing it for however many years. And now you're saying that, I shouldn't be in this position or I shouldn't be on this board. I had a really interesting conversation with someone when they said, I don't have an issue with the fact that we've got all women or all men. I don't care what it is. When you say to someone, do you think that all the men in your organisation are more intelligent than any of the women in your organisation? And they go, well, obviously not. And you go, well, yeah, obviously not. Therefore, something's going wrong at the inclusion level, that we're not getting that intake and it's not leading to the output we want.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think it's, Cheryl, I think your point about speaking up as well, and silence is not acceptable, silence is not okay. So we do need to keep talking about it and keep speaking up. Okay, cool. So from a statistics point of view, women make up 66% of junior managers, but only 40% of middle management versus 60% of men in middle management, and only 5% at the CEO level within the UK. So how do we go about overcoming that?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. All of the answers to this are very complex. These are very, very complex challenges that we're trying to kind of boil down into sort of, pithy sound bites. But, the thing that I would say is, the answer for me, because I think where people often go to around this is development programs for women. And I always think that isn't the answer. Like, women aren't broken. That's not what we're trying to fix here. I do think that something that is quite useful is things like sponsorship. Sponsorship of women, whether that's kind of formal or informal. But the thing that I always say is, when you're not in the room, who speaks up for you? Because actually that's really important. Whether you're from a minority background or you're female, it's very important that when you're not in that boardroom or that committee room or that project room, that somebody's speaking up for you, because often it's in those meetings that these decisions are made about who gets the opportunities, who's being promoted and why, and you need somebody in that room to speak up for you. So that's the one thing I always encourage women to do is forge those relationships, put yourself out there, etc., and get that sponsorship, because it's absolutely critical.
I think there's also a responsibility of those of us that have achieved success to look at women and go, okay, just because I didn't need it doesn't mean that other people don't need that support from me. And I think you can kind of go about your day and not really think about it, that, oh no, actually some women and some minorities, they need that kind of support. They need people to speak up for them. I think some of the people I've worked with, particularly women, I don't know if you've experienced this, Cheryl, but they also don't speak up for themselves. And I know I was one of them, in that, I suppose it goes back to my kind of view of, you know, look at the contents, not the packaging. I went through my career going, look, I'm producing really good results. I'm qualifying, I'm passing my exams, I'm great. And why isn't somebody recognising that and promoting me? And I expected somebody to come along and go, oh, well done, let's push you forward. Whereas the men in the organisation were going, I want to be a partner, I want to be a director, I want to do this, I want to achieve that. And a lot of the women I worked with have the same issue, that they don't necessarily put themselves forward. They are reluctant to go, look at me, like, look what I've achieved. Is that something you've experienced?
I think there is an element of that. And when I think about when I've interviewed, and I've interviewed a good couple of hundred people, you know, in my career, from like graduates all the way up to senior management. And there is definitely something about, you know, women aren't necessarily as aspirational, you know, as you say. So when you talk about like goals and what you're trying to achieve and putting yourself out there in terms of, you know, we all know about, you know, women only applying for roles if they feel they can do, you know, 95% of the job, whereas kind of for men it's slightly different. So I think there is an element of that. I think there is also something about the environment that's being created for women to thrive in. So, you know, we've all been in those meetings where, say, for example, if it's a board meeting, you know, women being talked over, etc. There are some very complex dynamics here. So there is an element of women need to step up, lean in, you know, as Sheryl Sandberg says, but there is also, you know, there are other factors at play in terms of the dynamic and kind of creating an environment where women can thrive, basically.
Cool. Okay, thank you. Let's think about how COVID-19 has affected different sectors of society. So recent reports from the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Fawcett Society indicate that the pandemic has disproportionately affected women. So, for example, mothers were 47% more likely to have permanently lost their jobs or resigned as a result of COVID. Mothers in a two-parent household were doing, on average, about a third of the uninterrupted paid work hours of the fathers. So what can we do to address this? What actions can individuals take, and what actions can managers take to try and address this problem?
I think it's a really difficult one. I think, as Cheryl rightly said, you know, we're talking about things that actually you can't boil down to these tiny actions sometimes, because they're huge systemic issues. And there we're looking at, you know, the culture in the UK where the mother is the primary caregiver. So I don't think that surprised me in terms of the numbers and the hours. I must admit, it did surprise me a little bit, and I suppose it depends how you carve the data up. I think maybe when some more of the final analysis comes out, we're going to see that graduates have been really strongly affected, and people that are entering the workforce. I think it makes sense when you look at all the other statistics that you see that women have been disproportionately affected, because we've just said they're not in those management positions. Therefore, their jobs aren't as safe. If you're not in a white collar role, if you're not in a senior role, then it makes sense that, you know, you've not progressed and you're maybe perceived to be a little bit more expendable. I think we're really going to see some problems where it's affected our whole society, and people that are in, you know, non-essential roles, people that work in hospitality. So I think it all ties back into the same things we've just been talking about, because if we've got women in more secure roles, maybe by adopting flexible working patterns, maybe by recognising that they do need, you know, different parental leave policies, I think that addresses it, and we're in a situation now where we're kind of dealing with the fallout of it.
Yeah, and just to add, I mean, I agree with you, Laura. I actually have an interesting view actually about flexible working and maternity leave, because you know, and I've been saying this for a few years, I believe that our approach to maternity leave for the past few years is actually part of what's put women back. Because we've focused so much on the maternity leave and the flexible working on the women. And I wish we kind of had more of the sort of Scandinavian model. So, something that's really interesting, and I think almost to answer this is to look at actually what's the changing role of men. So we know that more millennial men now want to kind of spend more time with family and want more parental leave. But at the moment, so the government announced this shared parental leave, which is where, both partners can take up to a year off, and they can share it between, the female and the male. But typically the take up of that is around 2%. 2% of men are taking up this opportunity to take parental leave. And I kind of think that's what we need to focus on. So in terms of, what can the managers do? I think there's actually something about creating an environment where men can step into the role of fathers, and it's kind of okay for them to take more leave and to kind of, do more in the home as well and be seen in that role, and it not be weird, which I think is, as Laura was saying, there is all this societal pressure, for mothers to kind of still bear the burden. Interestingly, so Sheryl Sandberg in her book Lean In, actually one of the bits of advice she gives to women, and I think in terms of individuals, is to, what she says is, make your partner a real partner. So what she means by that is, allow them to do their share of the homework and, in terms of the domestic kind of life, because I think in the UK we have this image, this acceptable image when it comes to things like Father's Day, etc., that men are like these kind of like, useless people that kind of just lounge about the house with their feet up. And for some reason it's just become like this laughable thing, but actually it then leads to things like, women doing the majority share of household chores and all of that sort of stuff, even when they've both got careers. So really complex, as Laura says. But I think for me, this one is where we really start to look at the role of men and how we start to stretch that so that it becomes as inconvenient to hire a father as it does a mother, basically. Yeah.
Cheryl, that last bit you just said, that inconvenience, I think that's something that people don't necessarily realise is a thing that goes on in people's minds. Yeah. And I know when I reached an age, when I hit my 30s, and if I was going for an interview, I would very subtly drop into conversation that I didn't have children, because I knew that somebody wouldn't be able to ask me. But I knew that if it came down to it and it was me against somebody else, that might be a factor in somebody's mind. And I think that when you spoke earlier about difficult conversations, we don't talk about those things. I was working with a couple of solicitors before lockdown. It seems like a different era, doesn't it? And we had around the table a lot of the partners in this firm, and they were kind of saying, well, we don't have an issue with these kind of things. And the female partner went, hold on a minute. At my interview, I was asked about my childcare plans, and the male partner, maybe a week apart, and he was like, I can't believe they asked you that. She said, around the boardroom table, her first big meeting, they said to her, don't you have somewhere to be when it got to 4 o'clock? Because they were thinking, oh, she's obviously got to go and look after her children. And she said, no, I'm fine. But the other men around the table said, oh, actually, I need to go and get my child. They all went, oh, aren't you fantastic? Oh, well done. That's a great job for going and doing that. And it was a really interesting story to hear that, that bias of being an inconvenience. I think we're all aware of it. It's there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
In terms of the Scandinavian way of approaching it, Cheryl, do you think that if there was, if we had more Scandinavian policy, so where it truly is shared parental leave, and you pop to a lot of the Scandinavian countries and you see groups of fathers walking around with their children in buggies during the day, do you think a policy change, would that drive a cultural change, or do you think it needs to be like people clamouring for it, culture to drive policy?
I think it has to be policy. It would have to be, it literally would have to be forced, because obviously that's what the Scandinavian countries do. The men are forced to take leave, but that's the only way you get to a situation where, when your children are at school, and I've had this, even though I've always kind of worked all over the place, but whenever, our daughter was ill at school, they would always ring me. Even though my husband has always worked local, but they would always ring me, and I'd be like 60 miles away or something, So I think, kind of just, if we got into a culture where men were forced to take leave, obviously I'm conscious that there are economic constraints and it may not work for everybody. But I think, if men were forced to take parental leave and kind of be that co-parent. To be honest, though, I think I'm probably sort of talking more for our generation, because I think, as I say, I think with the millennials, I think they are already moving towards wanting that anyway. Do you know what I mean? Hopefully we're just in a transitional phase.
Cool, excellent. Okay, thank you. So So let's talk about another topical item. So remote working. So most of us have been working remotely this year, obviously, as we are at the moment. And we're likely to continue to be doing so over the coming months. So when you're managing remote and diverse teams, what do you do to ensure that everyone's voice is heard?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually not that different. I almost think from when you're in the office. I think it's just something around, there is including everyone. I always sort of think, when I used to kind of be in the office and used to have remote teams, so I'd be kind of based somewhere and I'd have teams all over the place. I just had little tricks and, rules that I would use for myself as a manager, which would be, I didn't want my first communication to a team member to be an email. I always wanted to pick up the phone and actually speak to them. So just things like that, trying to keep up that human contact, and an actual phone call. And it doesn't have to be Zoom. Because often, we're getting to the stage now where by 5 o'clock we're all zoomed out anyway. So it could be literally that you pick up the phone to just kind of say, hey, how's it going? But I think when it comes to the Zoom calls, I would say, I think Zoom has made us very task focused. And a lot of the interactions just tend to be, okay, let's get into your agenda, blah, 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 blah. I would say, on things like Zoom calls, make time for people to check in, to properly check in terms of how you do it, just general banter, just human conversation.
Yeah,
I think is really important. Yeah, I don't know what you think, Laura.
I completely agree with that. Definitely with laughing that, we've gone to a time where we're so comfortable with virtual meetings that, someone puts a diary in and you don't even check to see which platform you're using because you're just so used to having them all now. But you go in, you get into the meeting, you get on with it, you tick off and you go, oh, ready for the next one. And I think we've lost that lubricant along the way, which is the bit that, when I'm chairing a meeting and I think, oh, well, Cheryl's just glanced at that person there. So, and I know her, so I know her body contact and I know that something isn't right there. And I think we've lost all of that. So we have to do more to try and make sure that we know the people that work with us, that we work with and go, okay, I can read your body language. I know something's wrong. Maybe after the Zoom call, as you say, that's exactly what I would advise is check in afterwards and make a particular note of the people that haven't said anything. Because I think people hide more on Zoom calls than they maybe have done. I think, when you're around a table, it's very easy to see someone and go, oh, they haven't said anything. But I think on Zoom calls, team meetings, teams, when you don't necessarily have everybody on your screen, so you tend to end up talking to just the people on your screen. I think making a point to check in with those people and go, what did you think? Is there anything else? But I think it's really difficult. And I think people are going to... I think a lot of the people I work with are going, actually, I quite want to go back to the office and have some contact for that reason, that maybe I don't want to go back full time, but I've kind of lost that connection, lost that human element.
So, I mean, how important do you think is it to sort of, I find that being authentic and being human is increasingly important when we're remote because you've lost that, as I said, you've lost that face-to-face contact. So I guess being a authentic and a human being and having a personal connection with people, whether it is by Zoom or by phone call, I think that's even more important, isn't it, now we're remote?
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I almost wish that we could have done with some like Zoom lessons or Zoom lessons. We've all kind of been thrown into this world, but things like, I'm sometimes, or certainly I was at the start, almost reluctant, sometimes to have a cup of tea with me or to, is it allowed to eat on a Zoom or, and all of these rules we're kind of not used to. We're so much more used to kind of meeting in person. And I wish that maybe, organizations and teams probably just need to kind of set their own rules, set whatever works for them in terms of what makes people feel most comfortable, because this is a very sort of alien environment. And actually somebody's done some research around how you feel when you're looking at a Zoom screen full of faces, and apparently it's a bit like feeling as though you're about to be eaten by a predator. So bearing that in mind, people need to make up their own Zoom rules, whether it's that you turn up on Zoom calls in your pajamas, kind of at the bottom half or whatever works for people, really.
Cool. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so the last of the questions before we get onto the live pre-submitted ones. So I want to talk about the gender pay gap. So the gender pay gap doubled between junior management and middle management from 5% to 10%, and then jumps to 19% at the highest level. So although we are making progress, the number of women on FTSE 100 boards remains at less than a third. So do you think that gender pay gap and ethnicity pay gap reporting has driven like real genuine improvements, or do you think it's driving the less desirable behaviour of quota filling?
The large majority of the clients I work with has had zero effect. I think it is something that they have just completely disregarded, whether they needed to, were mandated to or not. I think some of the people that I've seen working with it, they did it and did maybe some knee-jerk reactions. I think for a lot of people, the messaging was wrong around, they're going, you know, well, we've got equal pay. They weren't understanding that it wasn't about equal pay legislation. For me, I think we're looking at the wrong gap to be closing. I really think that we should be looking at social mobility. I think gender pay gaps and ethnicity pay gaps can often miss that. That there was a report published by the government in September that's looking at social mobility and basically saying your postcode is by far the biggest determinator of where you will be, or whether your children will earn more than you did. I think I did a quick check, and I don't think in the East Midlands and Eastern region we've got anybody in the bottom of the table. We've got a couple of areas, South Derbyshire and Forest Heath, that were at the top. And when you look at that, part of that is driven by having great employers in the area, great opportunities for people. So I think for a lot of the people that I work with, the gender pay gap and the ethnicity pay gap just hasn't had an impact at all, probably down to the size of the clients that I talk to, the majority of them, but it just wouldn't make a difference in terms of who they recruit, who they promote, who they retain. It's just not on their agenda, really.
I kind of agree with that, Laura. I think gender pay gap and the ethnicity pay gap are different. The ethnicity pay gap in particular, just touching on what you were saying, Laura, in terms of the social mobility. So obviously there is a strong correlation between the ethnicity pay gap and also social mobility in terms of class, you know, when you think about it, because, you know, at the top of the tree, kind of like, you know, white, male and middle class, and then the ethnicity kind of also, you know, is compounded by all the kind of social and class factors as well. I think in terms of whether the reporting has driven the wrong behaviours, I'm not sure, but do I think the reporting is driving change? Then I think the answer is probably no. And I think some of that, if I'm being completely honest, I just think that, and this is for another debate, because we could talk about this all day, but I think HR as a function has a lot of work to do, and a lot of these conversations, particularly at very senior levels, and we've all kind of seen them and all been privy to them, and you've got things like, you know, remuneration committees and all of that, they are not working. You know, they absolutely are not working. Some of the conversations at the top in terms of reward and recognition, it's very broken, basically. And so the reporting should be arming HR and enabling them to force the organisation to do the right thing. But for one reason or another, you know, politics, mates, peer pressure, whatever, it's not working. It's not working.
Cool. Okay. Excellent. Right. Well,
insightful note. Yeah.
It ain't working. Okay. Lovely. Well, thanks both. So I'll hand over now to my regional board colleague, Mark Ahurst, and he will go through some questions that we've received either sort of prior to the session or during the session.
Great stuff. Good evening. Thanks, Catherine, and thank you for hosting the inclusive leadership discussion, which can be very emotive at times. So clearly that's come out in the discussion so far. However, we've got some questions from our wider audience, and I'll pose our first one over to Laura, if you may. So first question we've got is, are there any challenges we face as a result of practicing inclusive leadership? If so, what are the common ones?
Okay, I think there's one really big one, and that is that a lot of the inclusion that we practice and a lot of the diversity results we're looking at exclude white men, of middle class white men, and there's been comments that we've made through it. Even, and I've raised, CMI published an article before where they referred to men being male, pale and stale, and it's something I personally hate. So this is not on behalf of CMI, this is me saying it's something I hate. And this question actually made me really stop and think about why this is an issue for me. And it's, I think a large part of it, all my clients are white middle-aged men. Or my bosses were white middle-aged men. My partner is a white middle-aged man. My father is a white, maybe not quite so middle-aged in our dad, but a white older man. So for me, I have had a lot of my career surrounded by this cohort. And I think, how must it feel, you know, for them to be seeing that, oh, we need to have more diversity, we need to have more inclusion. And there's a phrase, isn't there, where it says that equality feels like oppression to the privileged. So people that have been doing their job for so many years that, you know, there may be that 15 out of 16 on a leadership board, and they're going, well, I've done my job. And we've got people going, oh, well, that, you know, you've only got one person that's diverse or minority, you need to have more. I think that causes a real challenge for people. I think that it causes huge problems. I think if we look again back at America, which is what we were talking about, you know, very much when we started off the conversation, and I can't remember the statistic, I wish I'd written it down, but the majority think that there's racism against white people in that country because of a lot of what's happening, because of the diversity initiatives. They're starting to see a backlash over it. And it probably is the most controversial thing that we don't necessarily talk about. But for me, genuine inclusion is including everybody, is bringing everybody up to the same level, in a way that we don't make people that maybe have had some advantages and don't realise it, you know, they don't know they've had those benefits. And it's how do we take that people on the journey with us? And when you do, so one of my clients that I speak with quite regularly, we're talking about recruiting a new CEO. And we were talking about it, and he went, he, and then he went, oh, or she. And then he went, oh, sorry, I'm really sorry. I should have said she. And I said, no, the fact that you actually stopped and corrected yourself is because you are someone who believes in the value of inclusion and diversity. So to have someone like that, who again is, you know, a 48-year-old white male who has been doing his job for 20 odd years, I hate the thought that we're accidentally othering them, accidentally making them feel as though, you know, they're the minority. It's a big one, that one.
Michelle, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. I love that that quote that you used, Laura. I think that's brilliant. And there is something about, you know, when we talk about privilege and we talk about things like white privilege, you know, a lot of people and a lot of men, and if you think about it, like, you know, a lot of, say, working class men might think, I don't feel privileged. You know, this doesn't include me. I've actually had some real struggles. So I completely get it. I mean, obviously, you know, the fact is that, you know, still, if you are not white, male and middle class, you will have been disadvantaged compared to that. But we all know that. The quote that I love, actually, and I wholeheartedly agree with you, Laura, but there's a brilliant quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said, you know, fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. And I'm very much in terms of, you know, there is a way to fight for inclusion and fight for more diversity, but in a way that brings everyone along. Well, you know, maybe not the hardcore kind of part, but, you know, there is a way to do it in a way that kind of brings everyone along. It doesn't have to feel as though people are being attacked or shamed or, you know, whatever it be. There's a way to do it.
I'll give you a brilliant example of it. A few years ago, there was an event down in Tower Hamlets that I was asked to go and speak at, and it was for disadvantaged youth. It's quite an area of deprivation in East London, and I said, yeah, okay, of course I will, I'll go and support this. When I looked at the speaker profile, everybody was Oxbridge educated. It was all from finance houses, and when you looked at the delegate list, they were all nearly all Asian young men and women. Nearly all the children of doctors, dentists, they were all on the Oxbridge route. And I said, well, what about the white working class boys? Because they're the disadvantaged children in this area. So why aren't we doing things to reach out to them? And the owners went, oh, but we're minorities. And it's those kind of things that I think that if we don't get it right, you know, you've got a young white working class boy in East London going, well, where's the things for me? Where's my opportunity? Where's my thing that says, yeah, you know, off you go to, you know, a whole leadership event that's been invented just for you?
Well, thank you very much. That was a very full answer. Shell, can I come to you next, please? So the next question is, in your own personal work environment, how have leadership challenges changed during COVID-19? Do you feel people have been more considerate regarding the challenges we face now?
I think, not just because of COVID, but I think because of what happened over the summer, with the whole sort of Black Lives Matter movement, and just I think that's opened a lot of people's minds to, I guess, the realities of what we face. The reality is here in the UK, things are nothing like they are in the US, right? The US has got some major structural issues, which thankfully we're not in as dire a situation, I believe, as that. But I think that, in a really positive way, actually, has started to spark some really good conversations. And I think that it was a real kind of like awakening, almost like a real tipping point. And I think generally here in the UK, it has led to more conversation, people feeling that they can be more brave and perhaps have those awkward conversations. I'm fairly sure that there was probably a time when people didn't know what to say. And, even from a sort of COVID perspective in terms of managing people and, managing people remotely, I think there is that element of, how do I do this? What do I say? What's the right thing to say? Am I allowed to say that? Am I allowed to ask those questions? I'm hoping that coming out of COVID, it does lead to us being more brave, having quite brave conversations. I love the fact that, Laura and I have been able to speak very openly and candidly and haven't necessarily agreed on everything. But and that, for me, is what leadership and conversations should look like in a work environment. It should be kind of constructive, but straightforward.
And I think that being brave to be yourself, which is, I know, is something you're very, very strong on and very passionate about. I think that is when you get to the heart of the matter, because unless I'm talking to you and I'm honest about myself and you're talking, or Catherine or whoever it is, you're never really getting the output that you want. You're talking on kind of like up here. Whereas if you can be honest with people, if you can go, this is how I see things, and I'm happy to have my view changed, but you can only have your view changed if you're starting from a place of honesty in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, thank you very much. Laura, I'm going to stay with you for the next question then. How do you influence an organisation that isn't engaged in proactively embedding a diversity inclusivity culture?
Oh, show them the money. So I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to shout it. But start off. You're going to get some people that genuinely believe it, understand it, see the human reason why we should be more inclusive. Unfortunately, some people aren't going to see it like that. So show them the statistics. The McKinsey report that came out in the summer that said that, I think it was something like 36% more profitability for diverse organisations, up to 36%. You take that into a board, and I guarantee you that people will pay attention to it. You then follow that up with going, well, we need an action plan, we need a budget for it, we need to take defined activities. Don't just say there's your diversity lead, off you go. But for me, saying our action plan is, and again, it's my thing about inclusion. Are we recruiting in the right places? Are we only going to the same universities and they're saying fair? Or are we looking at apprentices? Are we looking at people from different backgrounds? Are we looking, as Cheryl said, at our parental leave policies, so that when we do have people in the organisation, we then retain them? Have we got sponsorship programmes? Have we got talent development programmes? So, but always start, show me the money.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I would, because there's been a lot of research on the benefits, like the upsides of having, more D&I. But actually, there's a massive cost as well to doing it badly. And I would say actually, there's a negative ROI, so a negative return on investment, if somebody invests in diversity. So potentially, they get their recruitment all sorted, so they get a diverse workforce, but they don't create an inclusive culture. That just leads to high churn, employee dissatisfaction, and that is actually a kind of negative cost. So I would say, there is a cost associated to it. Also, I think now in particular, in terms of winning business for organisations, if you haven't got this right, it is actually going to start to cost you. You are not going to win things like tenders, etc., if you can't prove that you have these values, because so many organisations, particularly if they're consumer facing, because they're getting pressure from their consumers. There's campaigns like Pull Up for Change, etc. So they are starting to feel the pressure to do the right thing. They are going to want to increasingly work with service providers who are doing the right thing. So if you're not doing it, you're going to start to lose out. So absolutely, I think Laura's spot on. It's show me the money or not.
I think there's another aspect to that as well, Cheryl, isn't there? In that when you're recruiting into the workforce, the generations coming in, they expect diverse initiatives. They expect well-being. They expect diversity. They expect you to take it seriously. They expect sustainability. They expect a whole host of things. But if you want to attract the right talent, which post-COVID is going to be so important when you're trying to rebuild and really want to get the cream of the crop, then really taking it seriously is something that is expected.
Yeah, 100.
Super. So we've got a question that's come in live during our chat and our discussion regarding inclusive leadership. So Cheryl, I'm going to pose this to you first. The question's coming from Ngozi. What about cognitive diversity? Is that not part of being inclusive? Clearly, a little bit of a wider answer against that would be appreciated.
It's a good question, and we sometimes hear people use terms like diversity of thought, etc. I mean, the reality is, without kind of getting too technical, we all kind of exist in planets of one, really. As Black people, we're not a homogenous group, so I don't think the same as every other Black person anyway. That's the reality of it. But the diversity and the reason for diversity isn't just around having sort of like different types of thinking. It's as an example, so a firm that's pulling together advertising campaigns, and I actually had this conversation with somebody last week. So a marketing firm that's pitching for some work with a project I'm involved in, but its marketing firm literally has zero diversity, and they're pitching to do some of social media management. And as I was having the conversation with them, I said, who in the room is going to recognise when you put out a campaign that is insensitive to somebody that's an ethnic minority? Because if you haven't got that diversity in the room, because somebody has that lived experience, you just may not spot it. And those are some of the things that you're trying to tackle by having a more, say, for example, ethnically diverse or, diversity in terms of gender or disability. You're trying to ensure that you reflect the needs of your various stakeholders, employees, and the community that you serve. Otherwise, you don't necessarily spot those things. And that's why we have things like, these clumsy advertising campaigns that, kind of use stereotypes where you kind of wonder, how did that get through all of the sign-offs? And that's why it's because there wasn't that diversity. So diversity of thought is great, but you still also need the representation as well. So I think it's kind of both.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, and the answer to the question, cognitive diversity for me absolutely is being part of inclusive, because being part of inclusive for me is getting as many people's voices heard as possible. In an ideal world, if we were looking at our content rather than our packaging, then you could have 10 white men that all could actually put themselves into the mindset of a Black woman, a mixed race woman, of a gay man. They could do that. If we can't get there, then we need to have representation, because they just won't be able to understand, that lived experience that Cheryl was just talking about. But I think, there are some people out there that they can put themselves very much into very other experiences that, you don't necessarily always need it. It's not like you need to go, okay, like, have I ticked everything off on my diversity checklist? Have I got one of each? Have I got a set? No, I don't think that's necessary, but definitely cognitive diversity forms part of that.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our last question of our webinar this evening. So Laura, I'm going to stay with you. So how do we create an environment where employees and leaders feel comfortable to have open conversations about how and why we value differences?
Got to encourage people to be able to speak up. We've got to encourage these conversations. I'm hoping that people will see that Cheryl is a Black woman and me as a mixed race woman, we've got different viewpoints on things. We're not homogenous, that, everybody's got their own viewpoint. We're all, an island of one, aren't we? So we all bring to the table something that is unique, something that we've got that is made up of our lived experiences, that is how we see things. And I think carrying on that conversation and, you know, having diversity initiatives, cognitive bias, you know, training and things like that. I hated it when the MPs laughed. You know, loads of Tory MPs have said, no, we're not going to do unconscious bias training. And it's like, well, it's so much more than just diversity. If there's something like at least 188 cognitive biases we all show, and recognizing that and that we all have them, that it makes just for such an interesting conversation when you realize how biased you are, you realize that you've been influencing things. So I think talking and dialogue, I operate on a policy of saying nothing is ever off the table. So, you know, you can say anything, bring anything to the meeting and bring your experiences to it, and no one's going to shut you down, because I want to hear that voice. I want to know what it is that you're thinking. Yeah. Cheryl?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. There's actually a brilliant TED talk, and I can't remember who it's by, but it's called Having Colour Braid Conversations. So specifically about the topic of race, which tends to be the more awkward conversations. You know, people are even not sure what they're supposed to call somebody of colour. You know, am I allowed to call that person black, or do I need to call them something else? So there's a brilliant TED talk called Colour Braid Conversations, and it's for organisations. So if anybody wants to watch that, that will, I think, give you tips on how you continue to do this. But I completely agree with Laura. It's creating an environment where those conversations can be had without recrimination, so without people feeling ashamed, you know, without kind of going on the attack. That's really important. I mean, one of the things that I'm obviously a massive fan of is, so I've been doing these book clubs because I wanted to learn more about, you know, kind of people that I wanted to, first of all, learn more about systemic racism as a result of what had happened this summer. But going into next year, and so one of the things that came out of it for me actually was I started to learn more about the challenges and the racism actually experienced by people of other minorities. So, you know, I learned a lot about the stereotypes of Asian women, for example, in particular, you know, and the objectification and all those sorts of things. And it made me want to learn more about people that weren't like me and what their lived experience was like. So for me, book clubs, you know, and I get a very diverse set of people to kind of come along and just have a conversation about a book and learn together and read together. And I know that's something that a lot of organisations are now doing, just like setting up these book clubs so that you're kind of all like learning, sharing and talking together, you know, in a fairly sort of safe environment. So that's my other kind of tip on that one.
Super. Well, thank you very much, Cheryl, Laura, for being candid and open and answer the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, thanks, Mark. So just to kind of wrap it up, Cheryl and Laura, so can you give us your three takeaway points really that have either worked well for you or that you feel are just a really key message?
Picking up from Cheryl's point there, where she was saying that, you know, these book clubs have allowed us to see other viewpoints from other minorities. I think recognising that everybody has got their own biases. Everybody goes into a situation with their own viewpoint. I've done it with silly things. I didn't go to university. I took the apprenticeship route. And I noticed at one point when I was reviewing CVs, this is maybe 15 years ago, I was almost subconsciously prioritising people that had taken the apprenticeship route because I'd done that and I knew it worked well. So I had to stop myself and go, whoa, no, that's a bias. And I think recognising that we've all got our own biases, speaking up about them, you know, even if you spot it and you do it and you go, oh, I've just judged someone there, that's fine, move on. I think recognising your own bias is a really powerful one. Ensuring every voice is heard, which I've just mentioned, so making sure that, you know, nothing's ever off the table. And then my last one to leave you with is just to echo what I was saying, is that for me, inclusion is very much an input and diversity is an output. If you get inclusion right, if you literally make sure that you remove barriers from when you recruit people, barriers for promoting people, if you keep people included at every stage, you will naturally lead to diversity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And just kind of leading on from that inclusion, I'm just going to really leave you with one thing and one example actually. So there's a guy called David Solomon, who is the CEO of Goldman Sachs, somebody that I've been watching for a while actually, who I really admire. But unbeknown to a lot of people, he has a nickname which is DJ Soul, and this is because at the weekends he is a DJ. And interestingly, for many, many years, he actually hid the fact. And he was then outed, like literally on YouTube. Somebody then shared photos of him DJing. And he really wrestled in terms of whether he should make it public. And even the rest of the board of Goldman Sachs, some of them weren't sure that he should share that because they felt that the public wouldn't take him as seriously. But he then thought, you know what, I'm just going to be myself. I'm just going to be myself. And so my one tip is actually leaders, and managers need to bring their whole selves to work. They need to stop kind of hiding elements of them. So when you turn up on a Monday morning and somebody sort of says, how was your weekend? Kind of share everything, within reason. But just be yourself, bring your whole self to work, because that's how you then give other people the permission to be themselves. And when you do that, that's what then creates the inclusive environment.
Yeah, excellent. I couldn't agree more. Bring your whole self to work.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, well, thank you very much, Cheryl and Laura. Thanks for joining us and for sharing your insights. It's been really interesting, and I think we've given some really valuable comments. So for those of you that are listening and watching, we'll be posting onto our social media accounts to keep the conversation going. So if you look for the hashtag inclusive leadership, and then hopefully you can share your experiences as well.
Thanks, Catherine. So that's it for this evening's session. Thank you to everyone that joined us this evening, and thank you to Catherine, to Mark, to Cheryl and to Laura for your insights and expertise. If you're a member of CMI, you can log into Management Direct using the link in the live chat box, where you'll find thousands of exclusive practical development resources and much, much more. And if you're not a CMI subscriber just yet, why not join our community via the link that's also in the live chat to gain full access to our Management Direct portal. And you can also sign up to the free CMI newsletter. And plus, via the link in the live chat or below, you can visit the CMI East Midlands and Eastern Regional Board's webpage. And from there, you can connect with the board's LinkedIn group, where you can also continue the discussion on this evening's topic. So thank you once again to everyone for joining us. Thanks to our speakers. Please do enjoy the rest of your evening.